The morning of June 6, 1944, Hauptmann Josef Priller stood on the tarmac at Lille-Nord airfield, watching mechanics fuel his Focke-Wulf 190A8 for what he knew would be either the shortest or the longest mission of his war. The sky above northern France was empty of German aircraft, and that emptiness carried more weight than any intelligence briefing could deliver. His entire squadron, Jagdgeschwader 26, had been ordered to Germany the previous day to counter American bombing raids. Everyone except Priller and his wingman, Feldwebel Heinz Wodarczyk, 2 fighters, 2 pilots, against whatever the Allies were about to throw across the English Channel. The radio chatter from coastal observation posts had been frantic since just after midnight. Paratroopers dropping in the darkness, gliders landing in fields, naval bombardment beginning at dawn. And now, as the sun broke through the scattered clouds at 05:30 hours, reports of an armada that stretched from horizon to horizon, thousands of ships. Priller had been a fighter pilot long enough to recognize what those numbers meant. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a diversion. This was the invasion everyone had been expecting for months, and the Luftwaffe had almost nothing in position to stop it. He climbed into his cockpit as Wodarczyk settled into his aircraft 30 meters away. The BMW engine fired with its familiar roar, and Priller taxied toward the runway. His orders were simple in their impossibility. Strafe the beaches. Disrupt the landings. Make the Allies pay for every meter of sand. 2 aircraft against an invasion force. The mathematics were absurd, but orders were orders, and Priller had not survived 101 kills by questioning the chain of command. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Focke-Wulf lifted off at 0600 hours, and Priller pointed the nose toward the coast. Below him, the French countryside was quiet, almost peaceful in the early morning light. Above him, the sky remained empty. No contrails, no formations, no sign of the massive air force that should have been supporting the German ground forces. That absence told Priller everything he needed to know about how this day would end. The Luftwaffe had been pulled back to defend the Reich itself, leaving the Atlantic Wall essentially naked against whatever the Allies had planned. At 2,000 meters altitude, Priller spotted the coast, and then he saw what every German defender had been dreading for months. The English Channel was covered with ships, landing craft cutting through the water toward 5 separate beaches, destroyers and cruisers pounding German positions with naval gunfire, transport vessels disgorging tanks and trucks, and thousands upon thousands of men. The scale was beyond comprehension. This wasn't warfare as Priller understood it. This was industrial annihilation delivered by a nation that could afford to build machines faster than Germany could destroy them. But it was the sky that made Priller's blood run cold, not empty. Not anymore. The entire dome of heaven above the invasion fleet was filled with Allied aircraft, fighters flying in formations so large they looked like flocks of migrating birds, bombers circling to deliver their payloads on German strongpoints, transport planes still towing gliders toward landing zones inland. Priller had flown over Berlin during heavy raids and never seen this many aircraft in one place. Hundreds. No. Thousands. The Allies owned the sky so completely that German air defense might as well not exist. He pushed the stick forward and dove towards Sword Beach, where British troops were wading through the surf toward fortified positions. Wodarczyk followed, maintaining his wingman position with the discipline that had kept him alive this long. At 500 meters altitude, Priller armed his cannons and machine guns. The closer they got to the beach, the more obvious the futility became. Every ship in the channel was firing anti-aircraft rounds at them. The sky filled with black bursts of flak, tracers arthered up from dozens of positions. And overhead, somewhere in that vast swarm of Allied fighters, someone would notice 2 German aircraft and come hunting. Priller lined up his gun sight on the beach and pressed the firing button. The Focke-Wulf shuddered as the 20mm cannons opened up, sending rounds into the mass of men and machines below. The pass lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he was pulling up hard, banking away from the beach, climbing back toward altitude with Wodarczyk right behind him. They'd made one strafing run, one attack against an invasion force that stretched for miles, and now every Allied fighter in the area knew they were there. He turned inland, pushing the throttle to maximum power, looking for cloud, cover, or any terrain feature that might help them survive the next 5 minutes. Behind them, the beaches continued to fill with Allied troops. Above them, the sky remained full of enemy aircraft, and ahead of them, northern France waited like a trap because every airfield that might offer refuge was either destroyed or would be attacked the moment they tried to land. Priller had been shot down before. He'd bailed out over enemy territory. He'd survived impossible situations through a combination of skill and luck. But this was different. This was the moment when the war's momentum shifted so completely that individual skill became irrelevant. 2 German fighters had attacked the D-Day beaches. The Allies had responded with a force so overwhelming that resistance became a mathematical impossibility. Priller would survive this mission and return to base. But what he'd seen over Normandy that morning would haunt every Luftwaffe pilot for the remainder of the war. The sky belonged to the Allies now, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could take it back. The road to that morning began 3 years earlier, when the Luftwaffe was still the most feared air force in the world. September 1941, and German fighter squadrons in France were hunting British bombers and fighters with near impunity. The Battle of Britain had been lost, but the Luftwaffe remained strong enough to contest Allied air operations over the Channel and northern France. Pilots like Josef Priller, Werner Mulders, and Adolf Galland were racking up kill counts that would have been impossible in any previous war. The Me-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were arguably the finest fighters in service anywhere. German radar stations dotted the coast, giving early warning of Allied raids. And, most importantly, Luftwaffe units were positioned throughout occupied Europe, ready to respond to threats from any direction. The German High Command understood air superiority's value. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that German fighters would protect the Reich from Allied bombing. That promise had seemed reasonable in 1941. The British Royal Air Force was still rebuilding after losses sustained defending England. American entry into the war was months away. The Soviets were being pushed back toward Moscow, their air force shattered in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Germany controlled the skies over most of Europe, but the foundation of that control was already cracking in ways German leadership failed to recognize. The Luftwaffe's strength was spread thin across multiple fronts. Hundreds of aircraft were committed to the Eastern Front, where the vast distances and brutal conditions consumed machines and pilots at an alarming rate. Units in France and the Low Countries were well equipped and well trained, but they faced an opponent who was learning from every engagement. The RAF had survived the Battle of Britain by adapting faster than the Germans expected. The strategic situation changed fundamentally in December 1941, when the United States entered the war. American industrial capacity dwarfed Germany's production by margins that made long-term victory mathematically impossible. But numbers on paper don't win battles immediately. The U.S. Army Air Forces had to build an air force from scratch, train pilots, develop tactics, and transport everything across the Atlantic before they could threaten German air supremacy. That process would take time, and time was a resource Hitler believed Germany could afford to spend. Throughout 1942, the Luftwaffe maintained operational effectiveness in the West. Losses were manageable. Replacement aircraft and pilots kept units at reasonable strength. German fighter pilots continued to rack up kills against increasingly frequent RAF raids. The doctrine remained sound. German fighters would intercept Allied bombers before they reached their targets, shoot down enough to make the raids prohibitively expensive, and convince the Allies that strategic bombing campaigns against the Reich were futile. But doctrine based on superior aircraft and pilot quality starts to fail when the opponent achieves rough technological parity and overwhelming numerical superiority. The RAF introduced the Spitfire Mark 9 in mid-1942, a fighter that could match the Focke-Wulf 190A in most performance parameters. The Americans arrived in England with P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, both capable of escorting bombers deeper into German territory than previous Allied fighters. And behind these immediate threats, American factories were producing aircraft at rates that German intelligence found difficult to believe. The Battle of Germany began in earnest during 1943, and it would destroy the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force over the next 18 months. The campaign started with American daylight raids targeting German industrial production, particularly aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants. The theory was elegant. Destroy the factories building fighters, and German air defense would collapse from attrition. The execution proved more difficult. German flak batteries and fighter interceptors inflicted savage losses on American bomber formations. Raids, like the attack on Schweinfurt in October 1943, saw the 8th Air Force lose 60 bombers out of 291, dispatched, a casualty rate exceeding 20%. Those losses forced the Americans to reconsider their entire strategic bombing campaign. Without long-range fighter escorts that could protect the bombers all the way to the target and back, daylight raids would remain prohibitively expensive. German fighters could wait until the short-range escorts turned back, then savage the unprotected bomber streams with relative impunity. Build a fighter with the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, while maintaining performance good enough to dogfight with the best German interceptors. The P-51 Mustang appeared in British service first, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that transformed an adequate fighter into something exceptional. The combination of laminar flow wings for efficiency and powerful engine for performance gave the Mustang capabilities that changed the strategic equation. Maximum range exceeded 1,600 miles with drop tanks. Top speed reached 440 miles per hour at altitude. And most importantly, the P-51 could turn with German fighters, climb with them, and fight them on equal terms while operating hundreds of miles from its home base. The first P-51 equipped fighter groups arrived in England during late 1943. By January 1944, they were escorting 8th Air Force bombers to targets deep inside Germany. The tactical impact was immediate. German fighters that had been attacking bomber formations with relative safety now found themselves hunted by escorts that could follow them to the deck and shoot them down in their own airspace. Luftwaffe pilot losses accelerated dramatically. The kill ratio shifted from favoring German pilots to favoring the Americans. But the true devastation came from a change in American fighter tactics implemented by Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle in January 1944. Previous doctrine required escort fighters to stay close to the bombers, providing direct protection. Doolittle's new orders were simple and revolutionary. Your job is to kill the Luftwaffe. This freed American fighters to hunt German interceptors aggressively, to chase them down to their airfields, to strafe aircraft on the ground, to attack anything wearing a German national marking regardless of where it was or what it was doing. The results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Pilot losses during the first 4 months of 1944 exceeded the rate at which new pilots could be trained. Experienced squadron and flight leaders died in numbers that couldn't be replaced. The knowledge accumulated over years of combat, all the tactical wisdom that made veteran pilots effective, was being systematically erased from Luftwaffe squadrons faster than it could be regenerated. By May 1944, many German fighter units were being led by pilots with perhaps 30 combat missions under their belts, leading other pilots with even less experience. The training pipeline couldn't compensate. German flight schools were producing pilots with perhaps 150 total flight hours, including maybe 30 hours in the actual combat aircraft they'd fly operationally. American and British pilots were receiving 400 or more hours of training, much of it in the same aircraft they'd use in combat. The experience gap became a death sentence. New German pilots survived on average perhaps 10 missions before being shot down. The Luftwaffe was burning through its human capital faster than any industrial system could replace. Aircraft production remained relatively strong through early 1944, despite Allied bombing campaigns. German factories were still delivering fighters in reasonable numbers. But aircraft without trained pilots are just expensive metal sculptures. The Luftwaffe's crisis wasn't industrial capacity. It was the systematic destruction of its trained pilot pool through attrition warfare that Germany had no way to win. Luftflotte 3, the German air fleet defending France and the Low Countries, watched its strength erode throughout the spring of 1944. Germany to defend the Reich itself against the endless American bombing raids. Fighter groups that had been based near the French coast were relocated hundreds of kilometers inland, leaving coastal defenses increasingly naked. The official Luftflotte 3 combat strength on May 31, 1944, listed 1,015 aircraft on strength, with only 570 serviceable. That serviceable number was the one that mattered. Fighters that couldn't fly couldn't defend anything. 115 serviceable day fighters to defend all of northern France and the Low Countries. 57 night fighters for the same area. 37 Sursturer heavy fighters. 49 ground attack aircraft. 247 bombers of various types, most of which were obsolete by 1944 standards. Against this force, the Allies would bring over 11,000 aircraft to support the D-Day invasion. German pilots understood the mathematics. Hauptmann Georg Schröder, commanding 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader II, recalled the situation in April and May 1944. Already it became clear to us at the front, through the increase in enemy escort fighters, now also with much greater range, and thus also the expansion of their combat zones, that the Allies clearly had air superiority. We'd scrambled to intercept Allied bombers, but there were so many escorts that actually reaching the bomber stream became nearly impossible. The psychological weight of fighting a losing battle affected morale in ways that official reports couldn't capture. Veteran pilots who'd survived 3 or 4 years of combat saw the writing on the wall. New pilots arrived at squadrons with minimal training and died within days. Aircraft that should have been held in reserve for training purposes were thrown into combat because there were no reserves left. Fuel supplies were being strangled by Allied attacks on synthetic oil plants, meaning that even available aircraft sometimes couldn't fly combat missions because there wasn't enough fuel to reach the target area and return. Oberleutnant Fritz Engau, commanding 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, described the operational tempo. We had 2 extra 20mm cannons built into the outer wings, and beneath the wings, 2 21cm rockets that were very effective against tanks and flak positions. But in this campaign I also flew as flight leader, squadron leader, and even group leader, though never with more than 4 to 16 machines. The Allies were operating with hundreds of aircraft at a time. We were lucky to put up a dozen fighters in good condition. The German High Command remained convinced throughout May 1944 that the main Allied invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the shortest distance across the English Channel. This belief, reinforced by an elaborate Allied deception operation called Fortitude, shaped German defensive deployments. Luftwaffe units that might have been positioned to defend Normandy were instead held near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. When the actual landings began on June 6th, the nearest substantial Luftwaffe concentrations were hundreds of kilometers away from the invasion beaches. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intelligence picture was fragmented and contradictory. German reconnaissance aircraft trying to monitor Allied preparations in southern England faced overwhelming opposition from RAF and American fighter patrols. Most reconnaissance missions were turned back before reaching their objectives. The few that got through and returned with photographs showed massive concentrations of landing craft and troops, but couldn't definitively prove where the invasion would strike. Allied air superiority over the Channel meant that German observers had limited visibility into what was actually happening just 25 miles from the French coast. Weather played its own role in German unpreparedness. The Luftwaffe Meteorological Center in Paris was predicting 2 weeks of stormy weather starting in early June, conditions that would make amphibious landings nearly impossible. Many Wehrmacht commanders convinced the Allies wouldn't invade during bad weather, left their posts for war games or leave. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Hermann ground forces in France, travelled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that the weather would prevent any Allied attack for at least several days. The Allied meteorological team, with better data from weather stations in the Atlantic, predicted a brief window of acceptable conditions on June 6th. That window was marginal, barely good enough to proceed, but Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made the call to launch the invasion on that date despite the risks. German intelligence, lacking access to Atlantic weather data, missed the forecast entirely. The invasion caught German defenders during a period when they believed weather made Allied operations impossible. When Allied paratroopers began dropping shortly after midnight on June 6th, German coastal observers initially couldn't determine if this was the main invasion or a diversion. Reports came in of airborne landings east and west of Caen, but the scale remained unclear. German reservists, including panzer divisions that might have counterattacked the landings, remained under strict orders not to move without direct authorization from Hitler's headquarters. And Hitler was asleep. Nobody wanted to wake the Führer for what might turn out to be a minor raid. By the time German high command understood they were facing the actual invasion, hours had been lost that could never be recovered. Luftwaffe 3 received confirmation of the invasion at dawn. The response orders went out immediately. Every available aircraft was to scramble and attack the invasion fleet. Priority targets were the landing craft and transport ships. Stop the Allies at the waterline before they could establish a beachhead. The orders were clear, but executing them proved nearly impossible. Allied air superiority was so complete that German aircraft trying to reach the invasion area were intercepted long before they could attack the actual landing beaches. The air battle over Normandy on June 6th was less a battle than a systematic demonstration of Allied dominance. German pilots who managed to take off from their fields faced immediate opposition from Allied fighters that outnumbered them 10-1 or more. Luftwaffe 3 managed to fly 319 sorties on D-Day, across all mission types: day, fighters, night fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties in direct support of the invasion. The disparity was so overwhelming that individual German aircraft became notable events simply for appearing over the beaches. Josef Priller and Heinz Wodarczyk's strafing run on Sword Beach became famous precisely because it was nearly unique. 2 German fighters attacking the beaches while thousands of Allied aircraft controlled the airspace above them. The image was captured in photographs and would later be immortalized in the film The Longest Day. But the fame obscured the reality. That single attack, lasting seconds, was the sum total of Luftwaffe effectiveness against the invasion beaches during the critical first hours. 2 aircraft. 1 pass. No measurable impact on the operation's success. Other German pilots tried to reach the invasion area throughout the day. Most were intercepted and shot down before they ever saw the beaches. Lieutenant Adalbert Beowulf of 3rd Squadron, Night Reconnaissance Group 13, managed to confirm the invasion through visual observation and return with the report. His was one of only 24 reconnaissance sorties Luftwaffe 3 flew on D-Day. Against an invasion involving over 11,000 Allied aircraft, 24 reconnaissance missions meant German commanders had almost no real-time intelligence about what was happening. Jagdgeschwader 2, based in Normandy itself, flew 19 Focke-Wulf 190s toward the coast armed with rocket launchers for attacking ships. The unit claimed 1 hit on an Allied vessel, though Allied records don't confirm significant damage to any ship from that attack. More importantly, getting 19 fighters airborne and formed up for a coordinated strike was an achievement in itself, given the overwhelming Allied air presence. Most Luftwaffe units trying to operate on D-Day were broken up by Allied fighters before they could even reach their objective areas. The night missions fared slightly better because Allied night fighter coverage was less dense. 3 Heinkel 177s from Bomber Group 30 took off from Bordeaux for a night bombing mission against the beachhead. All 3 were shot down by British Mosquito night fighters before reaching their targets. 35 night fighter sorties provided minimal harassment to Allied positions, but couldn't meaningfully disrupt the invasion. The mathematics were brutal. Germany was trying to defend against the largest amphibious operation in history with an air force that had been systematically destroyed over the previous 6 months. The pilots who did reach the invasion area and survive long enough to return, with reports described scenes that confirmed every German commander's worst fears. The Allied fleet stretched beyond visual range in every direction. Landing craft were shuttling back and forth between transport ships and the beaches, in numbers that made individual interdiction pointless. Shore bombardment from battleships and cruisers was suppressing German coastal defences faster than reserves could be moved up to reinforce them. And overhead, the sky was so full of Allied aircraft that attempting to attack anything guaranteed swift death from fighters that could dive on you from any direction. Hauptmann Georg Schröder's assessment was grimly accurate. On the invasion front, the superior numbers of the Allies were particularly large. The operations from June 6, 1944, in Operation Overlord, were particularly costly for us. Little more than 200 to 400 fighters were serviceable. We were hopelessly inferior to the English and Americans. The first 24 hours of the invasion cost Luftwaffe 3 dearly. Combat losses: aircraft destroyed on the ground by Allied fighters strafing German airfields, and operational accidents from pilots with inadequate training created losses that couldn't be replaced quickly. The promised reinforcements, 200 additional fighters within 36 hours and another 100 before June 10th, would arrive, but they'd be flying into a meat grinder where survival meant not being noticed by Allied fighters that hunted with near impunity. Lieutenant Gert Schindler transferred from the Russian front with 4th Group of Jagdgeschwader 27 and flew into Romilly on June 7th. The contrast between Eastern and Western theatres was immediate and brutal. On the Russian front, German fighters usually enjoyed at least local air superiority. In France, the Allies owned the sky absolutely. Schindler's unit flew their first operations on June 7th and immediately found themselves fighting Typhoons, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs. The mission days stretched from first takeoff at 0500 hours to last landings at 2200 hours. Schindler survived 3 days. On June 10th, only his 4th day in the Normandy theatre, he was shot down by a P-47 Thunderbolt. He took a bullet through the thigh, bailed out, and landed in an active French resistance area. A local farmer found him and brought him to a doctor rather than turning him over to the resistance. Schindler was one of the lucky ones. He survived. Most pilots transferred from other fronts to reinforce. Normandy didn't last long enough to develop any tactical understanding of how to fight in an environment where the enemy outnumbered you so completely. 7th Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 51 demonstrated the casualty arithmetic. They transferred from the Russian front and arrived in Normandy with 15 pilots. Within the first month of operations, 8 were dead, including the squadron's newly appointed leader. Barely more than half the squadron survived their first 4 weeks in combat. Those casualties weren't distributed evenly. The most aggressive pilots, the ones who pressed attacks despite being outnumbered, died first. The survivors learned quickly that discretion and survival were more valuable than aggression and probable death. The Luftwaffe's response to D-Day wasn't a failure of courage or even tactics. Individual German pilots fought with skill and determination. Squadron commanders deployed their forces as effectively as circumstances allowed. The failure was strategic and systemic. Germany had spent the previous 6 months losing an attrition battle over the Reich itself. The aircraft destroyed by American P-51 Mustangs over Berlin weren't available to attack landing craft in Normandy. The fuel burned trying to stop Allied strategic bombing raids wasn't available to support tactical air operations in France. By the time Allied troops waded ashore on June 6th, the battle for air supremacy had already been decided. The Luftwaffe had lost that battle over Germany during February, March, April, and May. The absence of German fighters over the invasion beaches wasn't a tactical surprise or a failure of German intelligence. It was the inevitable result of strategic decisions made months earlier, decisions that prioritized defending the Reich over defending occupied territories. Those decisions were rational given Germany's circumstances, but rationality doesn't change outcomes. The Luftwaffe couldn't be in two places at once, and the Allies had forced Germany to choose which battlefield mattered more. The choice meant that when the invasion came, German air defences in France were a hollow shell. The infrastructure existed: airfields, radar stations, flak batteries, all physically present. But the trained pilots and serviceable aircraft needed to make that infrastructure effective had been systematically destroyed in the skies over Germany. D-Day succeeded in part because the air battle that made it possible had been fought and won months before Allied troops ever touched French soil. The German pilots who survived D-Day understood they'd witnessed a historical turning point. The war wouldn't end immediately. There would be months of brutal fighting ahead. But the psychological impact of seeing 11,000 Allied aircraft operating with impunity over the invasion beaches was impossible to ignore. No amount of individual skill or tactical brilliance could overcome that disparity. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force capable of influencing major operations. What remained were individual pilots and squadrons doing their duty in a war that was already lost. The morning of June 6, 1944, Josef Priller made his strafing run and returned to base safely. He'd completed his mission as ordered, but what he'd seen over those beaches told him everything about how the war would end. The sky belonged to the Allies now, and in aerial warfare, whoever controls the sky controls the battlefield below. Germany had lost that control, and with it, any realistic hope of stopping the invasion that would eventually crush the Third Reich entirely. The weeks following D-Day revealed the full scope of Germany's aerial collapse. Luftflotte 3 received the promised reinforcements, 17 Jagdgruppen, in addition to the 6 already defending France, roughly 800 aircraft total on paper. But paper strength meant nothing when those aircraft had to fly through airspace controlled by 5,000 Allied fighters and fighter bombers. The transfer flights themselves became combat missions, with casualty rates that would have been unacceptable in any rational military calculation. Oberleutnant Fritz Ingau's experience transferring to the invasion front captured the nightmare perfectly. His unit, first group of Jagdgeschwader 11, flew from Germany to France on June 7th with reasonable numbers, perhaps 30 or 40 fighters. Over the forest of Rambouillet they encountered an approximately equal-sized force of P-51 Mustangs. In the Eastern Theatre, such an engagement might have been fought to a draw with both sides taking losses. Over France, the Germans were annihilated. Engau survived and even claimed a Mustang shot down, but most of his squadron didn't reach their destination airfield. The unit suffered appalling losses on the transfer flight itself before flying a single mission over Normandy. This pattern repeated across every reinforcing unit. Squadrons that arrived in France with 15 or 20 fighters would lose a third of their strength within days, sometimes within hours. The operational mathematics were unsustainable. Luftflotte 3 was losing aircraft and pilots faster than reinforcements could arrive, and the reinforcements themselves were increasingly composed of pilots with minimal training who died almost immediately upon encountering experienced Allied fighter pilots operating in an environment where they held every advantage. The Allied air umbrella over Normandy functioned like a layered defense system that German aircraft couldn't penetrate. High above the beaches, American P-38s and P-51s flew combat air patrol, looking for German formations attempting to reach the invasion area. At medium altitude, British Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts prowled in armed reconnaissance patterns, ready to dive on any ground target or climb to intercept German fighters. Close to the deck, fighter bombers attacked German troop concentrations, supply columns, and anything that moved during daylight hours. And behind all of this, medium and heavy bombers continued pounding German airfields, making it difficult for Luftwaffe units to operate from bases within range of Normandy. German commanders on the ground sent increasingly desperate messages about their inability to maneuver under Allied air observation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's report from late June captured the hopelessness. Enemy has complete command of the air over the battle zone and up to about 100 kilometers behind the front, and cuts off by day almost all traffic on roads or byways, or in open country. Maneuver by our troops on the field of battle in daylight is thus almost entirely prevented, while the enemy can operate freely. Troops and staff have to hide by day in areas which afford some cover. Neither Flak nor the Luftwaffe seems capable of putting a stop to this crippling and destructive operation of the enemy's aircraft. That assessment wasn't an exaggeration or defeatism. It was operational reality verified by every German unit fighting in Normandy. Moving supplies forward during daylight meant losing the trucks to fighter bomber attacks. Concentrating armor for counterattacks meant exposing panzers to airstrikes that could destroy entire formations before they engaged Allied ground forces. Communications became nearly impossible because radio transmissions attracted immediate air. Strikes on any German command post careless enough to broadcast during daytime hours. The German army in Normandy was effectively blind, immobile during daylight, and unable to mass forces for the kind of coordinated counterattacks that might have driven the Allies back into the sea. The Luftwaffe tried. Individual squadrons flew missions when they could, attacking what targets they could reach, dying in numbers that made the effort meaningless in strategic terms. During June 1944, Luftflotte 3 and supporting units flew approximately 13,000 sorties across all mission types. The Allies flew 96,000 sorties over the same period. German pilots claimed 414 aircraft shot down by day fighters, 219 by night fighters, and 672 by anti-aircraft fire, a total of 1,305 Allied aircraft. Those numbers, even if accurate, represented a loss ratio that Germany couldn't survive. Luftflotte 3 lost 458 fighters, fighter bombers, and reconnaissance planes in combat, plus 224 bombers, 7 supply planes, and 137 aircraft destroyed on the ground. On the surface, that looked like a favourable exchange ratio. But the Allies could replace their losses within days. Germany couldn't. And more critically, Germany was losing pilots, the irreplaceable trained personnel who took years to develop and couldn't be manufactured in factories. The quality gap accelerated catastrophically through June and July. Allied pilots accumulating combat experience became more dangerous with every mission. German replacement pilots arriving with minimal training died before they could learn anything useful. Squadron leaders who survived more than a few weeks were so rare that they'd be promoted to command entire groups despite having perhaps 50 total combat missions. The institutional knowledge that makes air forces effective, all the tactical wisdom about energy management, deflection shooting, mutual support, and threat assessment was being systematically erased from Luftwaffe units faster than it could be transmitted to new pilots. Oberleutnant Hans Rüdiger Hartigs of 4th Squadron, Jagdgeschwader 26, flew over the invasion area until being badly wounded in combat. His assessment of the situation was bleak. The operations from June 6, 1944, in Operation Overlord, were particularly costly for us. Little more than 200 to 400 fighters were serviceable. We were hopelessly inferior to the English and Americans. I was shot down twice in this campaign over northern France and bailed out the second time in August 1944. On this latter occasion, I was surprised by American fighters while landing to my own base. Being attacked while landing at your own airfield represented the ultimate failure of air defense. German pilots couldn't even find safety at their home bases because Allied fighters ranged so freely over occupied France that they could loiter near known Luftwaffe airfields and shoot down German aircraft during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing. The psychological impact was devastating. Every mission began with the knowledge that you might not survive to reach the combat area, and every return meant running a gauntlet of Allied fighters hunting specifically for aircraft trying to land. The British Hawker Typhoon emerged as particularly deadly during the Normandy campaign. Armed with rockets and bombs, Typhoons provided close air support to British and Canadian ground forces with devastating effectiveness. But they were also formidable air-to-air fighters when engaging German aircraft at low altitude. Aggressiveness that made them feared by Luftwaffe pilots who'd survived encounters with them. The combination of heavy armament, good low-altitude performance, and experienced pilots made the Typhoon exactly the kind of weapon that German air defences couldn't counter effectively. By the end of June, available German fighters in France numbered only 425 machines across all units. This number represented serviceable aircraft actually capable of flying combat missions, not the inflated paper strength that military organizations use to deceive themselves about their true capabilities. 425 fighters to defend all of France against 5,000 Allied fighters and fighter bombers. The mathematics were so lopsided that individual German air victories, even when they occurred, had no meaningful impact on Allied operations. The loss rate through June exceeded 25% per month, meaning that entire squadrons were being replaced 4 times per year. No military organization can sustain that kind of attrition and remain effective. The Luftwaffe in France, by July 1944, was effectively a training organization where new pilots came to die while learning lessons they'd never live long enough to apply. The veterans who'd survived the initial weeks after D-Day became increasingly cautious, prioritizing survival over aggression, breaking off engagements earlier, avoiding combat when outnumbered beyond certain ratios. That caution was rational self-preservation, but it further reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness. Air forces win through aggressive prosecution of offensive operations. Defense is inherently reactive and allows the enemy to choose time, place, and terms of engagement. German fighters over Normandy were perpetually defensive, reacting to Allied initiatives, unable to seize and hold any advantage long enough to exploit it. The strategic initiative had passed completely to the Allies, and no amount of individual tactical brilliance by surviving German pilots could recover it. Adolf Galland, general of fighters for the Luftwaffe, would later admit the obvious truth that German commanders understood but couldn't change. I, personally, am convinced that without your air force, the invasion would not have succeeded. It wasn't a compliment. It was recognition that Allied air superiority had been the decisive factor that made D-Day possible and its success inevitable. German ground forces in Normandy were competent, well-equipped by Wehrmacht standards, and fought with determination. But competence means nothing when you can't maneuver, can't receive supplies, and can't concentrate forces without being destroyed from the air. The strategic bombing campaign that had destroyed the Luftwaffe over Germany before D-Day continued after the invasion. American P-51, Mustangs and P-47. Thunderbolts still escorted bombers deep into the Reich, still hunted German fighters wherever they could be found, still strafed airfields and destroyed aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe couldn't rebuild its strength in the West because the fight over Germany consumed every available resource. Pilot training was accelerated to the point of being nearly useless. New pilots reached operational units with perhaps 100 hours total flight time, sometimes less. They didn't know how to dogfight, couldn't manage energy effectively, lacked the situational awareness that keeps pilots alive, and died within missions of their first combat sortie. The collapse fed on itself. Losses created shortages that forced shortcuts in training that produced inadequate pilots who died quickly, which created more losses. Germany was trapped in a death spiral where every attempted solution made the underlying problem worse. Concentrating fighters for massed attacks meant fewer fighters available elsewhere. Pulling units back from France to defend Germany meant abandoning occupied territories to Allied air domination. Accelerating training meant producing pilots who couldn't survive. There were no good options remaining, only choices about which unacceptable outcome to accept. The Allied advance through France during July and August 1944 ground forward against determined German resistance on the ground, but faced almost no meaningful opposition from the air. Luftwaffe sorties declined as losses mounted and fuel supplies dwindled. By August, many German fighter units were flying only a handful of missions per week due to fuel shortages caused by Allied bombing of synthetic oil production facilities. Aircraft sat on airfields, fully armed and maintained, but unable to fly because there wasn't enough aviation fuel to conduct operations. The final indignity came when German ground forces began retreating from France in August. The withdrawal should have been covered by air support that could interdict Allied pursuit forces and protect German columns from air attack. Instead, German units retreated under constant harassment from Allied fighters that attacked anything moving on French roads. The few Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to provide cover were overwhelmed and shot down without significantly disrupting Allied air operations. Josef Priller survived the Normandy campaign and would eventually reach 101 confirmed kills before the war ended. But his experience on D-Day remained emblematic of the Luftwaffe's situation throughout the battle for France. Individual courage and skill couldn't compensate for overwhelming material disadvantage. 2 German fighters attacking the invasion beaches while 11,000 Allied aircraft controlled the sky above them. That image captured everything about the strategic situation in June 1944. The Allied air forces that achieved supremacy over Normandy weren't invincible. They took losses. Aircraft were shot down. But they absorbed those losses and continued operating at full effectiveness because the industrial base supporting them could replace anything destroyed faster than Germany could inflict the losses. American factories produced over 96,000 aircraft in 1944. British factories added thousands more. German production, despite heroic efforts, couldn't match 1/3 of Allied output, and German production didn't matter when trained pilots didn't exist to fly the aircraft being built. The air battle for Normandy was decided before it began. The systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe over Germany during the first half of 1944 meant that German air defences in France were a hollow shell by June 6. The infrastructure existed, but the trained personnel needed to make it effective had been killed over Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, and 100 other German cities while defending against American strategic bombing to raids. D-Day succeeded because the Allies owned the sky. Military history often focuses on dramatic turning points, single battles that changed everything. But the air campaign that made D-Day possible wasn't a single battle. It was 6 months of grinding attrition warfare fought in the skies over Germany, where American fighter pilots systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's trained pilot pool faster than it could be regenerated. By the time Allied troops waded ashore in Normandy, that battle had been won. The absence of German fighters over the invasion beaches wasn't a tactical surprise or intelligence failure. It was the inevitable result of strategic decisions made months earlier and combat operations that had systematically dismantled German air power through calculated attrition. The 11,000 Allied aircraft supporting D-Day represented industrial capacity that Germany couldn't match. Pilot training programs that produced competent aviators faster than combat consumed them, and strategic thinking that recognized air superiority had to be won before the invasion began. The Luftwaffe fought bravely. Individual German pilots demonstrated skill and courage throughout the Normandy campaign, but bravery doesn't overcome mathematics. Skill doesn't defeat overwhelming numbers when the enemy is equally skilled and possesses superior equipment in vastly greater quantities. The morning of June 6, 1944, German defenders counted Allied aircraft over Normandy and understood they were watching their own defeat unfold in real time. Hundreds of planes initially, then thousands. Then so many that counting became pointless because the sky was simply full of aircraft, all wearing Allied markings. The psychological impact of that sight broke something in German military confidence that no amount of propaganda could repair. If the Allies could put 11,000 aircraft over a single invasion area, while Germany could barely manage a few hundred sorties, what hope did the Reich have of winning a war against such overwhelming power? The answer was none. Germany had already lost the war by June 6, 1944, though the fighting would continue for 11 more months. Allied air supremacy over Normandy demonstrated that Germany couldn't defend its occupied territories, couldn't protect its own airspace, and couldn't prevent Allied forces from operating wherever they chose. The Luftwaffe, that had once been the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to scattered squadrons, flying hopeless missions against an enemy that grew stronger every day. While German strength withered from attrition, it couldn't survive. Josef Priller's strafing run on Sword Beach became famous because it represented the last gasp of German air power in the West. 2 fighters attacking the largest invasion in history. When those 2 Focke-Wulfs turned away from the beach and disappeared inland, German air defense of France effectively ended. Everything after that morning was aftermath, the slow grinding process of Allied victory made inevitable by the air superiority won over Germany during the months before D-Day. The sky belonged to the Allies on June 6, 1944. It would remain theirs until Germany surrendered 11 months later. Air power had proven decisive in ways that 19th-century military theorists never imagined. Control the sky, and you control the battlefield below. The Allies controlled the sky over Normandy completely. German ground forces, no matter how competent or determined, couldn't overcome that disadvantage. The invasion succeeded because 11,000 Allied aircraft ensured it would succeed by making German air defense impossible and German ground resistance and sustainable under constant air attack. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. 11,590 Allied aircraft versus 400 German aircraft that could actually fly on D-Day. 14,674. 5,409. Allied fighters and fighter bombers versus 115 serviceable German day fighters. They were overwhelming to the point of being farcical. Germany was fighting with 1/20th the air power the Allies deployed, and that fractional force was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The German pilots who survived Normandy carried memories of flying through skies so full of Allied aircraft that survival depended more on luck than skill. They remembered watching friends shot down by enemy fighters that appeared from nowhere because there were so many Allied aircraft that you couldn't track them all simultaneously. They remembered the frustration of knowing that their sacrifice was accomplishing nothing meaningful in strategic terms, that every mission flown and every pilot lost was just delaying the inevitable rather than changing the war's outcome. And they remembered the morning of June 6, 1944, when the sky over Normandy filled with Allied aircraft and German air defense ceased to exist as an effective military force. That morning represented the culmination of strategic decisions made months and years earlier. The Allies had chosen to build air forces capable of overwhelming any opposition. They'd developed training programs that produced pilots faster than combat consumed them. They'd created industrial systems that manufactured aircraft in quantities that Germany couldn't match. And they'd prosecuted an air campaign over Germany that systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe before the invasion began. D-Day succeeded because air superiority made it possible. The 11,000 Allied aircraft over Normandy weren't symbolic. They were the decisive weapon that ensured the invasion would succeed, regardless of German ground resistance. The Luftwaffe's absence from the invasion beaches wasn't a failure of German military competence. It was the result of a strategic air campaign that had already won the battle for air supremacy before Allied troops ever touched French soil. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.